There was another war. A war that never officially happened. A war where an entire country was destroyed in silence. Where children as young as 12 were given rifles and told to fight a superpower. Where the sky rained steel for 9 years without stopping. And here's what makes it truly terrifying: most Americans didn't even know it was happening. Because officially, it wasn't. No declaration of war. No congressional debate. No evening news coverage. Just bombs. Millions of them. Falling on villages that didn't appear on any map, killing people who didn't have names in any Pentagon file. The United States dropped more explosives on this one country than on all of Germany and Japan combined during World War II. Every 8 minutes. 24 hours a day. For 9 straight years. A planload of bombs. Every 8 minutes. For 9 years. Do the math. That's more than 2 million tons of ordnance. Dropped on a country the size of Utah. A country that most Americans couldn't even find on a map. A country that, according to international law, was neutral. A country where no American soldiers were supposed to be. But they were there. In the thousands. Living in a city that didn't exist on any official map. A city that, at its peak, had the busiest airport in the entire world. Busier than Chicago O'Hare. Busier than London Heathrow. Busier than Tokyo Narita. And when the war ended, when America packed up and left, they abandoned tens of thousands of people who had fought for them. Left them to be hunted down like animals. Left them with a promise that was never kept. This is the story of the secret war. The war America tried to erase from history. The war that's still killing people today, 50 years after the last bomb fell. This is the story of Laos. Let me take you back to 1964. The Vietnam War is escalating. American soldiers are dying in the jungles. The North Vietnamese are pouring weapons and troops down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of hidden roads and paths that runs through the mountains of Laos. The Pentagon has a problem. If they can cut that supply line, they can win the war. But there's a complication. A big one. In 1962, 14 nations signed the Geneva Accords. They declared Laos a neutral country. Foreign troops were forbidden. The United States military could not legally enter. The world was watching. The Soviets were watching. China was watching. So what did America do? They cheated. Not publicly. Not officially. They did what empires always do when the rules don't suit them. They created a loophole. Enter the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA already had a history in Southeast Asia. They'd helped orchestrate coups in Iran and Guatemala. They trained death squads in Latin America. But what they were about to do in Laos would become the largest paramilitary operation in the agency's history. Larger than Afghanistan in the 1980s. Larger than anything that came before or since. They called it a police action. They called it humanitarian assistance. They called it everything except what it actually was, a full-scale war. And they built it around a single location. A hidden valley deep in the mountains of northern Laos. Surrounded by limestone karsts that made it invisible from the ground. A valley that, on official maps, was marked as uninhabited jungle. But if you flew over it in 1968, you would see something impossible. You would see runways, warehouses, barracks, a communications tower, fuel depots, arms depots, a hospital, bars, brothels, opium dens. You would see an entire city teeming with 40,000 people, most of them armed. They called it Long Cheng, or Lima Site 85. But the pilots and soldiers who operated there had another name for it. Spook Heaven. Because everyone there was CIA, or worked for the CIA, or was being paid by the CIA. This wasn't a military base. This was a shadow state, a parallel government, a kingdom ruled not by laws or democracy, but by one man. His name was Tony Po. Anthony Poshepny. That was his real name. But everyone called him Tony Po. And if you've ever seen the movie Apocalypse Now, you've already met him. Because Colonel Kurtz, the rogue commander played by Marlon Brando, the man who went too deep into the jungle and lost his mind, was based on Tony Po. Except Tony Po was real. And arguably worse. He arrived in Laos in the early 1960s. A farm boy from California who joined the Marines, then the CIA. He was tough, charismatic, and fearless. The kind of man who thrived in chaos. And Laos in 1964 was pure chaos. Tony Po didn't follow the rules. He made his own. He drank a bottle of whiskey a day. He walked around shirtless with bandoliers of ammunition draped over his chest. He once got into a bar fight so violent that part of his nose was bitten off. He never had it fixed. He wore the scar like a badge. But here's what made Tony Po legendary and terrifying: he paid bounties for enemy body parts. You heard that right. Bring him the severed ear of a North Vietnamese soldier and he'd pay you. Cash. No questions asked. The more ears you brought, the more money you made. He reportedly kept jars of them in his office. Why ears? Because they were easy to carry. Proof of a kill without the weight of an entire body. There are stories, and I want to be clear, these are stories that have been repeated by so many soldiers and journalists that they've become part of the legend, stories that Tony Po once dumped a bag of severed heads onto a village from a helicopter to terrify them into compliance. Stories that he executed prisoners in front of their comrades to send a message. Was Tony Po insane? Maybe. In any other place, on any other timeline, he would be in a straitjacket. But here? In the lawless mountains of Laos? He was a founding father. Because Tony Po wasn't a rogue agent. He was doing exactly what the CIA wanted him to do. They needed someone who could win a war in the shadows. Someone who could operate outside the Geneva Conventions. Someone who could get results without asking for permission. But winning a war requires more than just madness. It requires money. Lots of it. And this brings us to the darkest chapter of the Secret War. A chapter that explains how a massive, off-the-books operation was sustained for so long. You see, Congress controls the budget. If you want to fight a war, you need appropriations. You need hearings. You need transparency. The CIA didn't want any of that. They needed a source of income that was untraceable, liquid, and abundant. They found it in the poppy fields. This region of Laos, Thailand, and Burma isn't just mountains and jungle. It is the Golden Triangle. For centuries, it has been the world's primary source of high-grade opium. Before the war, the opium trade was slow, local, transported by mules down narrow mountain paths. It took weeks to get the product to market. But then the CIA arrived. And with them came Air America. Air America was the CIA's private airline. They flew rice, medicine, and weapons into the remote Hmong villages. But the planes couldn't fly back empty. That would be inefficient. So, according to numerous investigations, reports from journalists, and testimonies from pilots, those planes flew back filled with opium. Raw, sticky, black opium. The CIA provided the logistics. General Vang Pao, the Hmong leader, provided the product. It was a perfect, symbiotic relationship. The Hmong farmers grew the opium to buy food and weapons. The CIA transported it to refineries. The profits were used to bribe local officials, pay warlords, and fund the war effort. It turns out, the fight against communism was being subsidized by the drug trade. While American politicians were declaring a war on drugs back home, in Laos, their intelligence agency was arguably running the largest drug transport network in the world. Air America became Air Opium. The heroin refined from this opium flooded into Vietnam. It found its way into the veins of bored, terrified American GIs in Saigon. It found its way to the streets of Harlem and San Francisco. The irony is sickening. The CIA was helping to flood the world with heroin to finance a war that nobody was allowed to talk about. It was a crime thriller playing out in real life, directed by the US government. So, Tony Poe had his madness. The CIA had its drug money. But they still needed bodies. They needed soldiers to pull the triggers. And since they couldn't use American troops, they turned back to the Hmong. The Hmong are a hill tribe. An ethnic minority that has lived in the mountains of Laos for centuries. They're farmers, mostly. They grow rice on terraced hillsides. They raise pigs and chickens. They live in villages made of bamboo and thatch. But they're also warriors. Fiercely independent. Fiercely proud. And in the early 1960s, they had a problem. The communist Pathet Lao were moving into their territory, taking their land, forcing them to join collective farms, killing anyone who resisted. The Hmong hated the communists, and the CIA knew it. So the CIA made them an offer, a deal, a promise. We'll give you weapons. We'll give you training. We'll give you money and rice and medicine. All you have to do is fight. Stop the North Vietnamese. Sabotage the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Rescue American pilots when they get shot down. And when the war is over, we'll take care of you. We'll protect you. We'll make sure you and your families are safe. The Hmong agreed. They didn't have much choice. It was fight or be enslaved. The CIA recruited General Vang Pao. He was young, ambitious, charismatic, a natural leader. He commanded respect, and he believed the Americans. He believed the promise. At first, it worked. The Hmong were incredible fighters. They knew the jungle. They knew the mountains. They could move silently through terrain that would kill a trained Marine. They ambushed North Vietnamese convoys. They blew up supply depots. They rescued downed American pilots and carried them through enemy territory to safety. The CIA was thrilled. They had found the perfect proxy army. Cheap, effective, expendable. But there was a problem. The war kept going and going, and the Hmong kept dying and dying. By 1967, they were running out of men. The CIA had a solution. Lower the recruitment age. At first, it was 18, then 16, then 14, then 12. Let me say that again. 12 years old. Look at the photographs from that era. You can find them in archives, in documentaries, in the books written by the few journalists who managed to get into Long Cheng. Look closely at the faces of the Hmong soldiers. You will see boys. Not men. Boys. Some of them are so small they have to hold their M16 rifles at an angle because the barrel is longer than they are tall. 12-year-olds. 13-year-olds. Given grenades and told to attack fortified positions. Given machine guns and told to hold the line against trained soldiers. Told that if they died, they would be heroes. And they did die. In staggering numbers. Estimates vary, but historians believe that between 30 and 40,000 Hmong were killed during the Secret War. Out of a total population of around 300,000. That's more than 10%. An entire generation. Wiped out. The CIA knew this. The White House knew this. The Pentagon knew this. But it was efficient. A Hmong soldier cost the United States government about $10 a month. An American soldier costs thousands. And when a Hmong soldier died, there was no body bag. No flag-draped coffin. No letter to a grieving mother in Kansas. Just a name scratched off a list. If they even had a list. The Hmong were the perfect army for a war that didn't exist. Because when they disappeared, no one noticed. While the Hmong fought and died on the ground, the sky belonged to America. And the sky was falling. Operation Rolling Thunder. Operation Steel Tiger. Operation Barrel Roll. These were the code names for the bombing campaigns. Sanitized language for industrialized slaughter. The goal was simple: destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Cut off the supply lines to Vietnam. Bomb the jungle so thoroughly that nothing could move through it. But the Ho Chi Minh Trail wasn't a single road. It was a network. Hundreds of paths. Some were wide enough for trucks. Others were just footpaths. They shifted constantly. The North Vietnamese would repair a bombed section overnight, reroute around it, and keep moving. So the US Air Force decided to bomb everything. Villages. Farms. Forests, rivers. If it were in Laos, it would be a target. Pilots flying missions over North Vietnam would return with unused ordnance. Bombs they didn't drop because they couldn't find their targets, or because the weather was bad, or because they got called back early. The standard procedure was to jettison the bombs before landing. Because landing with live ordnance was dangerous. But where do you dump them? Over Laos. Always over Laos. Pilots were given free-fire zones. Entire regions of Laos where they could drop bombs without asking for permission. Without checking if there were civilians below. Without even looking. It became routine. Casual. Some pilots called it taking out the trash. And the bombs they used weren't just ordinary explosives. They were designed to kill people. Specifically, efficiently, cruelly. Cluster bombs. Let's break down the engineering of death for a moment. A large canister bomb, the CBU-24, is dropped from a plane. At a preset altitude, the casing splits open. Centrifugal force spins out hundreds of smaller submunitions. BLU-26. They are tennis ball-sized spheres. Each one is a marvel of destruction. The outer shell is cast steel, scored with a grid pattern. Inside, there is high explosive. When the fuse strikes the ground, or a tree, or a roof, it detonates. The steel shell shatters along the grid lines, sending 300 steel fragments flying at supersonic speeds. These fragments aren't designed to destroy tanks. They are designed to shred soft targets. Muscle, arteries, eyes. One cluster bomb unit can saturate an area the size of 3 football fields. And the United States dropped 270 million of them on Laos. 270 million. Let that number sink in. That's more than 80 cluster bombs for every single person living in Laos at the time. 80 bombs per person. For a war that officially didn't exist. The Plain of Jars, an ancient archaeological site filled with 2,000-year-old stone jars, was turned into a moonscape. A wasteland of craters. The bombs destroyed everything. The jars. The villages, the farms, the people. The survivors learned to live underground. In caves. They farmed at night. They cooked at night. Because if you lit a fire during the day, the smoke would give away your position. And the planes would come. An entire generation was born in the dark. Children who never saw daylight until they were 5 or 6 years old. Who grew up thinking that the sound of jet engines was as natural as thunder. For 9 years, the people of Laos lived like this. Hunted from the sky. Every 8 minutes. For 9 years. And then, suddenly, it stopped. 1973. The United States signed the Paris Peace Accords. The Vietnam War was officially over. American troops were going home. The helicopters were leaving Saigon. And the CIA was leaving Laos. They packed up Long Cheng. Shredded the documents. Burned the files. Dismantled the radio towers. Loaded the planes with equipment, weapons, and cash. But what about the Hmong? What about the 40,000 people who had fought for them? Who had bled for them? Who had been promised protection? General Vang Pao was airlifted out. A few hundred high-ranking officers and their families were given seats on CIA planes. They were flown to Thailand. Then to the United States. Resettled in California and Minnesota. But the rest? The tens of thousands of soldiers and their wives and children and parents. They were told to wait. The Americans will come back, they were told. The planes will return. Just wait at the airstrip. So they waited. Families gathered at the Long Cheng airstrip. They brought their belongings. Everything they could carry. Photos. Clothes. Rice. Imagine the sound of that moment. Not the roar of engines. Not the explosion of bombs. But the crushing silence after the last C-130 faded into the clouds. The dust was settling on the empty runway, and thousands of eyes looking up at a sky that had turned from a savior into a tomb. The sky remained empty. The planes didn't come back. The CIA had left them, abandoned them to the communist forces they had spent a decade fighting. Forces that now saw them as traitors, as collaborators, as enemies. What happened next was a slaughter. Pathet Lao soldiers moved into the mountains. They hunted the Hmong, village by village, family by family. They executed anyone who had worked with the Americans. Soldiers, translators, cooks. It didn't matter. Thousands fled into the jungle. Starving, sick, hunted. Some made it to the Mekong River and tried to swim across to Thailand. Many drowned. Others were shot by border guards. The CIA's promise was a lie, and the Hmong paid for it with their lives. This wasn't collateral damage. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate betrayal. The United States used the Hmong as long as they were useful, and when they were no longer needed, they were discarded. Like tools, like ammunition, like trash. You might think this story ends in 1973. That once the bombs stopped falling, once the soldiers went home, the war was over. You would be wrong. Because 30% of those cluster bombs, those 270 million bomblets, didn't explode when they hit the ground. Defective fuses, soft mud, tree branches. For various reasons, nearly 80 million bombs failed to detonate. They are still there, buried in the mud, hidden in the rice paddies, waiting. The technical term is unexploded ordnance, UXO. But in Laos, they have a simpler name. Bombies. They look like toys. Small, round, brightly colored. Yellow, mostly. Some are blue, red. They're about the size of a tennis ball, perfectly designed to catch a child's eye. Children find them in the fields. They pick them up. They shake them. They try to pry them open to see what's inside. They want to play catch. And then they explode. Every year, dozens of people in Laos are killed or maimed by bombs that fell 50 years ago. Farmers hit them with their plows while tilling fields. Mothers hit them while digging foundations for houses. Children hit them while playing. The bombs are still killing, still maiming, still destroying lives. There are organizations working to clear the bombs. Brave men and women who go into the fields with metal detectors and carefully, slowly, dig them up and detonate them safely. But the work is dangerous and slow. At the current pace, it will take another 100 years to clear all the unexploded ordnance from Laos. 100 years. That means children who haven't even been born yet will die from bombs dropped during a war their great-grandparents barely remember. This is the legacy of the secret war. This is what happens when a superpower fights a war in silence. When there's no accountability, no oversight, no consequences. The United States government has never formally apologized for what it did to Laos. There's been no reparations, no compensation, just a few $1 million a year for bomb clearance. A fraction of what it would cost to truly fix what was broken. Because acknowledging the full scale of the destruction would mean acknowledging the lie. The lie that this was a limited operation. The lie that it was necessary. The lie that it was justified. And so the story remains buried, hidden in classified files and forgotten archives. A secret war that most Americans don't even know happened. But for the people of Laos, there was nothing secret about it. They lived it. They survived it. And they're still dying from it. So let me ask you a question. When a superpower fights a war that officially doesn't exist, who is responsible for the dead? Is it the politicians who authorized the bombing? The generals who planned the missions? The pilots who dropped the bombs? The CIA agents who recruited child soldiers and then abandoned them? Or is it all of us? Everyone who didn't ask questions? Who didn't demand answers? Who let it happen in silence because it was easier not to know? The Vietnam War is taught in schools. There are memorials, documentaries, movies. We know the names. Ki Sang, Tet Offensive, My Lai. But how many of you had ever heard of Long Cheng before today? How many knew about the Hmong? How many knew that the United States dropped more bombs on Laos than on all of Europe during World War II? This is what happens when wars are fought in secret. When empires operate in the shadows. When the machinery of violence runs without oversight. The dead don't make the news. The survivors don't get parades. The children who lose their legs to 50-year-old bombs don't get memorials. They just disappear. Into the jungle. Into the dirt. Into history. And we move on. Because it's easier to forget than to remember. Easier to look away than to acknowledge what was done in our name. But the bombs are still there. Still waiting. Still killing. History is written by the victors, but the truth is often buried in the mud, waiting to be found. We are dedicated to digging it up, one story at a time. If you want to help us uncover the next one, join this channel. Subscribe.